the Apache Web Server. In this nugget, we're going to talk about the Apache Web Server. We'll look in depth at the Apache configuration file, and we'll learn how to restrict access to your web server, and we'll also talk briefly about the logging capabilities that are built into Apache. So let's get started. Let's start by talking about the Apache Web Server, and the latest version of Apache that's out there is version 2.0. Now, I recently read on the internet a survey that said that 65% of all the web servers out there are using Apache. Okay, now that's a pretty strong statement, right? Because this is a piece of free software, but it shows just how important Apache has become in the world of the internet. Okay, and Netcraft is kind of a cool website. You can go on there and look at various domains out there on the internet, like Microsoft.com or Yahoo or Google or whatever, and it does a little probe of the websites, and it tells you what web server they're using and also what the underlying operating system they're using, if it can determine that information. Okay, so so this just says Apache's an important piece of software, especially for Linux. Most of the Linux people, most of the servers out there that are running Linux are running Apache to go along with it. But Apache 2.0 has made a lot of modifications so that it will run well on other platforms besides Linux. Now, we did an installation of Apache back in the introductory videos, so I'm not going to walk you through a whole installation of Apache, but I just wanted to refresh your memory as to what the packages are that you can use or that you can install to have like the full kit and caboodle with relating to Apache. Okay, and these are all RPMs, so you'd have to install all these RPMs to have the full deal. Okay, first one here is HTTPD, and that's the actual web server itself. HTTPD-devel is for development tools for the web server, so you can do things like compile in new modules and stuff. Red Hat config HTTPD. This is a graphical user interface to help with the configuration of the web server. HTTPD-manual. This is for documentation for the web server. And if you install this RPM, the documentation is going to live in /var/www/html/manual. Mod Perl and Mod Python are both language interpreters for the respective languages for Apache. So this is a Perl interpreter for Apache, and this is a Python interpreter for Apache. Mod SSL allows you to support encryption, so you can use protocols like secure HTTP. AutoConf is for creating scripts. This is for makefiles, and LibTool is just some generic libraries, some shared libraries that you're going to need for Apache. Okay, so there's the packages that you'll install, all those packages, if you want the full functioning version of Apache. Now, in terms of starting and stopping Apache, there's two basic ways that you can do this. One is you can do it manually from the command line, and the other way is you can do it automatically. So when your system boots up to a particular run level, Apache will start automatically. So let's talk about manually first. The first way to do this is you can execute this command /etc/rc.d/init.d/httpd /start. Okay, and this will start up the HTTP daemon, okay, which is the web server. And there's any number of directives that you can use here. There's start, there's stop, there's restart. There's also reload, which is a good one. That will actually restart or force the web server to reread its configuration file, but it doesn't ever stop the web server. So if this is a web server in some production environment that you don't want to shut down, but you've made a change to a configuration file that you want the web server to use, you can just say here reload. Okay, and that's also sometimes called hupping a web server. Another way that you can do this exact same thing is by using the Red Hat Linux service command. So here I can say service space HTTPD space start, and that will do the exact same thing as above. And again, there's a whole slew of directives here: start, stop, restart, reload, and so on. Okay, so that's how you can do it manually with either one of those commands. To do it automatically, what you have to do is you have to change the services that are started automatically at a particular run level. One way to include HTTPD as a service that gets started at a particular run level is you use the check config command. So chk config. And here I'm giving an example of how to include HTTPD to start automatically at level 5. So I say --level space 5 HTTPD space on. So this turns on that daemon when the system boots into run level 5. Okay, if I wanted this to go into run levels 3 and 5, I'd say minus minus level space 3, 5, and the 3 and 5 would be right next to each other with no spaces, and that would turn the daemon on whenever the system boots into run level 3 or 5. Okay, now, so if it's some sort of production machine and you're not doing anything else on the machine, then you should probably just start it up and run level 3, right? You don't need any sort of X Windows interface eating up memory or CPU time, anything like that. So you'll just start it in sort of the most basic run level that you can, like run level 3, and then the daemon will start automatically at that run level. Okay, another way to do this exact same thing here is to use the graphical user interface tool, Red Hat-config-services, which we've used earlier in this series for configuring some other service to start automatically. And then what you do is you pick a particular run level, like run level 5, and you scroll down the list looking for Apache to check that box so that will start up. Actually, you're not looking for Apache, the word Apache, you're looking for HTTPD, right? That's the name of the service that you're starting when you're starting and stopping Apache. Okay, so now let's move out to the Linux screen and look at some of the configuration files and some of the other stuff related to Apache. Then we'll come back to the whiteboard again to talk about restricting access to your web server using Apache. Well, let's look at the configuration file for the Apache Web Server. That's in the etc directory under httpd, under conf, and the file is called httpd.conf. Okay, so this configuration file you'll see is like the most well-commented configuration file you'll ever see. It's got a detailed description for every single variable that's set or every single directive that's set. It has a detailed description of what it is just above the setting of that particular variable. So in this case, server root equals etc httpd. Well, what's server root? Well, here it tells you server root is the top of the directory tree under which the server's configuration files, error files, and log files are all kept. So this tells you where to look for configuration files, error files, and log files, and we found the configuration files under etc httpd/conf. Okay, so again, it's telling you exactly what's going on. Notice here it says do not add a slash at the end of the directory path. That's important. It tells you that so that make sure that when you edit this, if you wanted to change what the server root was, you don't put a slash at the end. Okay, so as we page down here, you'll see all sorts of variables. If you want to experiment or investigate what all these things are, just read the descriptions and they tell you pretty much what they are. All these max alive requests, these keep alive timeouts and keep alive requests have to do with persistent connections on your web server. If we page down farther here, you'll see listen. This is a variable telling you where the Apache web server is listening for traffic. So it's listening on any machine, :80, which says port 80 on any machine. That's where it's listening for traffic. Okay, as we page down farther here, you'll see a whole bunch of modules get loaded. So these are all sort of like add-ons to the Apache web server. If you're a developer, you can compile in other modules to customize the web server for your installation, and then you would load the module in this section here. Okay, and as we go down, here's another nice thing about the configuration file. Extended status, okay? This variable here says it controls whether Apache will generate full status information when extended status is on, or just basic information when extended status is off. Okay, notice here it says the default is off. But it gives you the command to actually turn it on. It says extended status on. It just leaves it commented out. All these lines that start with a sharp sign here are comments that are not actually executed. So if I came through here and I said, I do want that full status information, all I have to do is delete that sharp sign or that hash mark at the beginning of the line to turn that on. So not only do they tell me what all the variables mean, they actually, show me how to set them, but they just leave it commented out, so it's very easy for me to set and change the values of these variables without even typing anything, just deleting the hash marks. Okay, another nice feature of the configuration file. Here's another important fact, is that the user and the group that are running the Apache web server are both set to Apache. Okay, now what does this mean? This means that the Apache web server is running, and the controlling process, the owner of the process, is Apache itself. Okay, we've created this user on our machine called Apache, and that's who's running the web server. Now, the user Apache and the group Apache have a very limited set of privileges. They have enough privileges so that they can do all the things necessary for the Apache web server, but they can't do other stuff. Okay, and here's why this is good. Because just say you had a script on your web page that went awry, either because you wrote it incorrectly or somebody's cracked into your system and altered the script somehow. Okay, if that script was actually running as like the root user, then the potential danger is a lot greater. Okay, if the script was running wild, deleting files, for instance, or something like that, and it was running as the root user, well, nothing would stop it because the root user has full privileges. But if it's running wild as the user Apache, then not a lot's going to happen because Apache doesn't really have that many privileges. Okay, so it's important to leave these both set to Apache. Do not change them to something like root, for instance. Okay, if we page down, you'll see a server admin. This is the email address of the administrator of the server. Server name, it's just set to localhost by default. But if you had a domain name here like www.cbtnuggets.com, that's what you would write here under server name. Okay, as we go down a little farther here, I want to show you a couple other things. Document root, this is where your HTML documents will live, /var/www/html. Okay, if you want to change that, you can alter this address. Again, make sure you don't have a slash on the end of that particular listing to make sure that it goes to the right directory. Alright, well now I've paged way down in httpd.conf here, down like 20-some pages of stuff, to get to this section, because we're going to move back out to the whiteboard to talk about this in more detail. I just wanted to give you a little glimpse of what goes on down here at the bottom and what's actually happening. What we're doing down here at the bottom of the configuration file is restricting access to our web server in some way or another. We're either restricting access based on what machines can access these directories that we're talking about, or we're going to restrict what kinds of operations can be done in these directories. And you'll see in more detail once I explain all the various options and things like that when we go back out to the whiteboard exactly what's going on here. I just want to give you the idea here of just the general idea of what's going on. So what we're doing is for a particular directory, we're setting options that say what is allowed in this directory. Okay, and down here for the var www.html directory, okay, again we have a set of options set, and then we have an allow field, so we're saying allow access from all machines, and then we've got this order field that says allow and then deny. Okay, and I'm going to explain what all this means in a minute, but see how it's set up, that for a particular directory we have a set of options for that particular directory. If I page down farther, you'll see the var www CGI bin directory. So the place where I would put scripts, CGI scripts on my system would go into this particular folder, and then I can restrict access to that folder, again, either by machines, what machines are allowed to execute those scripts, or I could say whether scripts can even be executed in that directory at all, that sort of thing. Okay, so now let's move back out to the whiteboard, talk about this stuff in more detail, and you'll see what we're trying to get across here, and I'm going to show you how to do some basic access restrictions on your web server. Alright, let's continue talking about access restrictions in Apache. And what we're doing here is we're defining what services are allowed on a directory by directory basis. Okay, so like we just saw in the configuration file a minute ago, we define for a particular directory what services we want to allow on that directory, and then those rules apply recursively from the parent directory on down, unless we make a specific rule for some particular subdirectory. Okay, so what we saw in that configuration file a minute ago was something like options follow symlinks, or options indexes, or something like that. So let me explain what the 5 valid fields are for the options directive, and then we'll talk about other ways to restrict access. Okay, so indexes here, what this will do, if options indexes is set for a particular directory, then if you try to pull up some web page like www.redhat.com/files, okay, I'm just making this up off the top of my head. So if you try to pull up that web page, it's not actually an HTML page that I've asked for. I've said redhat.com/files. I'm asking for a particular directory. Well, what the web server will do will look for index.html by default in that particular directory. If index.html does not exist in that directory and the indexes option is set here, if I say option indexes, then the web server will do a directory listing of that particular directory to help the user navigate and find the files that he's looking for. Okay, if options includes is set, that means that server-side includes are allowed in this directory. A server-side include is just something that gives a little bit of dynamic content to an HTML page, like the current date or the current time or something like that. Okay, and it's not a full-on like CGI script, but it is a little bit of dynamic content, and that is allowed if it says options includes on a particular directory. Follow symlinks. It means that the user that's on the web page can follow a symbolic link to some other directory. You should be careful if you set this. You should be aware of where all your symlinks are going in your document route there, where your web pages are. Make sure you know where all the symlinks are going, because if somebody can follow symlinks, if you set this option, then they might be able to get to some other part of the file system that you didn't intend them to be able to get to. Exec CGI says that you can execute CGI scripts for this particular directory. And multi-views just has to do with, there's this weird thing about if a particular document isn't there or it can't be found, then the server tries to figure out which document is the best one to show you. Okay, if you want help configuring this, look into the mod negotiations module or the Apache manual talking about mod negotiations. Okay, so in addition to these 5 things here, you can also set options directives as all or none. Okay, none is obvious. None of these are included. All includes the first 4. Multi-views is something separate. You have to explicitly say that you want that included. All does not include that by default. Okay, so if you say all, you'll get all 4 of these enabled for your particular directory. Now this is one way to restrict access. Another way to restrict access is with the allow and deny qualifiers. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I've put a little snippet of the configuration file, what I would include in the configuration file if I was trying to allow access from a particular domain. So the way this starts is by saying order, deny, allow. So this says process the deny fields first, then process the allow fields. So here I'm saying deny from all, allow from cbtnuggets.com. So this is what this is doing, in effect, is saying deny all traffic. Nobody can look at this web page unless they're from the cbtnuggets.com domain. Okay, so that's the way you can set this up. If you switch the order here, if you say order, allow, deny, then the allow parts are done first, and then the deny parts are done second. And the deny part, if I just said allow from cbtnuggets.com, deny from all, then nobody would be able to access my system because the deny thing would take precedence because that's the second thing I checked. Okay, so that's kind of the way this is working. Another way to restrict access to your system. And one last way I want to talk about restricting access is using passwords to restrict access. So we're not talking about the same passwords that you would use to log into the system. We're going to create a separate password file. It's going to have a similar structure to Etsy password, but it's going to be specifically for the web server. Okay, so the way that we create this password file is we say htpassword, P-A-S-S-W-D, -C for create. Then we create the file name. Here I've called it web users, and then the username is Perry. Okay, once I type this command in, then I'm going to be prompted for a password for Perry. I would type that in. It would show up as just blank characters, and then it would then put an encrypted version of that password in this web users file. Okay, so then if I want to add more people to this file, I would say htpassword. I would leave out the -C because this was creating that file. I would just say htpassword web users Joe. Okay, and then Joe, and then I type a password for Joe, and then Joe would also have an entry in the web users password file. Okay, so that's the first step, is creating the actual password file. And then to get Apache to use this file, what we would do is we would add this section here to the particular directory that we're trying to restrict access to with passwords. So auth name is just, some it's just some name of the particular thing that we're trying to protect. The auth type is basic. We're not doing anything fancy here. There's other authentication types, and you can read about those in the Apache manual if you so choose. Then the auth user file, we give the full path name to the actual file, and we've called that web users. That's the same name we gave up here in the htpassword command. And then we say require valid user. Okay, so this is saying require that a user can get validated. So when you go to access some particular directory, then that we've applied these rules to, then what it's going to do is it's going to prompt you for a username and a password. You've got to give a valid username and password that's in this web user's password file, and if you do that, and then you've met the requirements, and then you'll be able to see the stuff in that particular directory, or see the file that you asked for in that directory. Okay, so that's yet another way to restrict access to your web server using passwords. There is actually one more way that I want to talk about restricting access to your web server, and that's by using a combination of the allow override directive and what we call .htaccess files. Okay, so let's look at an example here. This is the best way that I can explain this, is via an example. And this would be a listing in the the httpd.conf file that we were just looking at on the Linux screen a few minutes ago. This is the directory by directory restrictions that we've been talking about. So for a particular directory that I've listed here, I've said options none. Okay, now what this means is that in this directory and any subdirectory of this directory, I can't have CGI scripts be executed. I can't have server-side includes, that sort of thing. Okay, and I've also said here allow override none. All right, so that means that this rule here, options none, cannot be overridden by anything else. Okay, so that's like what we understand already. All right, but if I use a different directive here other than allow override none, if I said something like allow override options, for instance, then what this is saying is that I am allowing I am allowing this rule, options none, to be overridden by rules in a local .htaccess file. So let's pick a subdirectory here. Let's say I've got this subdirectory var www html/Perry. Okay. Well, in this directory, if I've got this allow override options directive set in httpd.conf, then in this particular subdirectory, I can create a file called htaccess. Okay, and in that particular file, I can say something like options includes. Okay, now what this would say is that I am allowing server-side includes in the Perry subdirectory of var www.html and all subdirectories of this Perry directory. Okay, so this file then sort of takes precedence over httpd.conf because I've said I'm allowing overrides of the options directive that I just said. Okay, now what's the effect of this? What's the purpose of this? Well, presumably, in this example here, Perry is my directory in like the web space. Okay, so this is where all of the web files will go under var www.html, and maybe I've set aside a bunch of directories for Perry, Joe, Bob, whoever, as their personal directories so they can have their own space on the web server. Okay, so I would have ownership of this directory. So I would also have ownership and writing capabilities to my local .htaccess file, so I can set up my particular subdirectory however I want. Okay, so this is nice because then the users get some control over how their particular subdirectories are, what capabilities they have, whether they all have server-side includes, whether they can execute CGI scripts, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's a reason that people might want to use .htaccess files. Okay, but there's a real problem here, or a caution. Okay, so beware. Using these .htaccess files, what this can do is it can actually end up impacting server performance. Okay, so I'm going to say it can cause a performance hit. All right, and this is why it can cause a performance hit. Because if I allow these options to be overridden in httpd.conf, then anytime I do any sort of an access to some subdirectory of the Perry directory, for instance, I've got to look in that particular directory for an htaccess file to see if this particular option is allowed. Okay, for example, say there's a server-side include in Perry/work/whatever/whatever, and way down in some subdirectory I do a server-side include. Well, then the web server's got to look in that directory for an htaccess file that allows includes to be done. If it's not in that directory, then it has to go up a level and look for an htaccess file in that directory. And if it's not there, it would have to go up a level and look for a .htaccess file in that directory. If it doesn't find any htaccess files up to here, and then there's this rule that takes place for var html, then this would take precedence, and server-side include would not allowed to be done. But if it finds an htaccess file along the way up this directory tree, say in the Perry directory, that allows server-side includes, then the web server would let that server-side include happen, and then it would just happen, and boom, it's done. Okay. But the amount of work that had to be done to allow that server-side include was looking in all these various directories and trying to determine which rule is taking precedence here. Okay, so it can cause a performance hit if there's lots and lots of these .htaccess files. Okay, and the only reason that you would ever really do this is like if you were an ISP. Okay, and you had all these different individuals out there on your ISP that wanted different rules for each of their particular directories. So you set up some basic rules in the httpd.conf file that they can't touch. They can't edit this file or write to this file. And so if they want to change the permissions or the capabilities of their particular individual space on the web server, then this is the way to do it, is via htaccess files. But it can really cause a performance hit, so you shouldn't do it in any cases except extreme cases that you absolutely need this control. Okay, so that is the last way that I want to talk about restricting access to your web server, and now let's talk about logging capabilities of Apache. Alright, so here we are back on the Linux screen, and we're in the httpd.conf file again, and we're looking at the section of the file that refers to logging. Okay, so logging just means the information that we're keeping about activity on our web server. Okay, the first directive here is error log, and that just tells me the location of the error log, /var/log/httpd/error log. Okay, then the next directive is an important one. This is the log level. Okay, so this is saying that what type of messages should go into the error log. All right, and there's all these categories of messages: debug, info, notice, warn, error, crit for critical, alert, and emerge for emergency. Okay, so basically, as we pick log level warning, what that means is that anything with a warn, an error, a crit, an alert, or an emergency level would be logged to our error log. Okay, but things like with debug, info, or notice levels would not be put into the error log. Okay, and if you do put, if you do loosen this restriction from warn to notice, for example, then the number of messages in your error log will increase because more messages meet this looser criteria. Okay, so that's why they say it controls the number of messages logged to the error log. All right, but the two most typical values for a log level would either be warn or error on web servers that I've seen. Okay, so that's for the error log. Now, the other thing here that they've got is a set of log formats. Okay, and this looks like a big bunch of gobbledygook, okay, a bunch of percent signs and letters and things like that. But basically what you should get out of this is that there's this log format, and it's called combined. There's another log format called common. There's another log format called referrer, and there's another log format called agent. Okay, if we want to use one of these formats, then down below here, let me just page down a little, you'll see for our custom log for our particular installation, which is in the log/access log is what it's going to be called. And notice there's no leading slash here. So this is saying using the basic root of our server, which is /etc/httpd. Then it would be /log/access log. That's where that would be kept. We're using the combined format for that access log, which says we're using this line from above, and each line in the access log will have this format. Okay, now what does this format mean? Well, each of these things means a particular item is logged to our particular log file. So %H would mean the remote host is there. %L would be the remote log name. %U would be the username that they use if this was an authenticated part of the web server. So if they had to type a username and a password, %U will be the username that they use to get in. %T is the time. Okay, so each of these things means something. There's a whole bunch of other other options that we could put inside of the quotes here. We could put in, %A for the remote IP address and things like that. Okay, there's just all sorts of information we can keep track of. And if you want to add something to keep track of it, add it into this particular format. And then down here, when it says custom logs, we're using the combined format. If you added something to the combined log format here, it will begin to show up in your actual access logs. Okay. If you want to see the whole list of different items that you can put into a log file, then you refer to the Apache manual. They've got the whole list there. Refer to a book about Apache or something like that. And there's just a whole slew of different pieces of information that you can put into that log file. All right, well, that wraps up our discussion about log files. Now let's just wrap up this nugget. All right, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget on the Apache Web Server. We talked quite a bit about the configuration file for the Apache Web Server, which is located in this directory, and the file is called httpd.conf. Okay, we talked about the rules and the directives in this particular configuration file so that we could restrict the access to our web server, restrict the capabilities of our web server. So we could restrict the access to our web server from certain machines. We talked about the allow and deny directives so that we could allow access only from our particular company or something like that. We also talked about restricting the capabilities of our web server, whether the web server could run CGI scripts or server-side includes on a directory-by-directory basis. Okay, so in the conf file, there was an entry for each directory and the kinds of things that could be done in each of those directories. We also talked about using authentication to restrict access. So we could make a particular part of our web server, directory on our web server, accessible only to people that had a username and password that we set up. Okay, and so this is another way to restrict access. We also talked about the .htaccess files and overriding the options set in httpd.conf, and I told you that while that is a valid measure that it can actually work, it's not necessarily a good way to go about things because of performance reasons. And finally, we just talked briefly about logging and the types of information that you can have put into your log file. Well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.